65-year-old man agrees to surrogacy, deal with Mongolian family, ends up becoming patriarch. The first thing Arthur Finch noticed was the smell. It wasn't the acrid tang of dung fuel or the gamey scent of boiled mutton that had become the backdrop to his existence for the past 3 weeks. This was different. It was the smell of something ancient and alive, of crushed juniper and hot stones, of an intention so potent it felt like a physical presence in the felt-warmed silence of the gur. Goyun, the family's matriarch, a woman whose face was a roadmap of 80 Mongolian winters, held his wrist. Her grip was not strong, but it was absolute. Her thumb pressing into the soft blue vein that pulsed with a rhythm that felt entirely foreign under this endless sky. Before them, kneeling on a thick woolen rug, was Alton. Her head was bowed, her long black hair a silken river down her back. She was the reason he was here. She was the vessel. Oyen murmured something in her low, guttural tongue, the words worn, smooth as river pebbles. Ganbatar, Alton's husband, and the man whose pride Arthur was meant to salvage, stood by the central pole of the JR. His face a mask of stoic reverence, his eyes fixed on the smoke hole at the peak, as if the gods were peering down, judging. He held a silver bowl filled with what looked like milk. Arthur had assumed this would be a clinical transaction. A sterile cup, a discreet room in Ulaanbaatar, a contract signed and witnessed. He had wired the first half of the Mania sum. That represented the final, undignified liquidation of his failed London consultancy had been told only that the family wished for a period of integration before the procedure. Now, Oyen was guiding his hand, not towards a cup, but towards Alton, towards the gentle swell of her belly, still flat beneath the layers of her silk deal. His hand, liver-spotted and trembling slightly, hovered in the charged air between them. He could feel the heat radiating from her skin. This was not a clinic. This was a ceremony. This was something else entirely. He looked from his own hand to Alton's bowed head, to Ganbatar's rigid back, to Oyen's unblinking, black-eyed gaze. The agency had called it a unique surrogacy arrangement. They had used words like cultural sensitivity and traditional values. They had not used the word ritual. They had not explained that to give his seed, he would first have to give his spirit, and that the two were, in the eyes of this family, inseparable. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of old bone. He had come here to erase a past failure, to plant a single anonymous seed of legacy in a foreign land. But as his fingers, guided by the old woman's unyielding will, finally brushed against the warm silk covering Alton's flesh, a terrifying question bloomed in the insensate air. What had he actually agreed to? 3 months earlier, Arthur Finch was a ghost haunting a pristine apartment in Kensington that mocked him with its soulless perfection. It was Eleanor's taste, all cool grays and minimalist art. A space designed for a life of cocktail parties and quiet successes, had never quite achieved. Now, it was just a mausoleum for one. Eleanor was gone 2 years, a sudden, merciless aneurysm that had taken her mid-sentence while she was complaining about the hydrangeas. The silence she left behind was louder than any argument they'd ever had. His son Mark was gone too, in a different way. The estrangement was a wound that festered, oozing a constant low-grade shame. It had been about money, of course, was always about money. Arthur, in a last-ditch attempt to prove he still had the Midas touch that had defined his early career, had sunk the entirety of Mark's inheritance the money. Eleanor had so carefully ring-fenced into a speculative commodities deal, a sure thing. He could still hear the slick, confident voice of the broker, a young shark who probably now owned a yacht. The deal hadn't just failed. It had evaporated, taking with it Mark's future and Arthur's last shred of paternal authority. The final conversation was a scar on his memory. Mark, his face pale with a fury that was more painful than any shouting, standing in the doorway of this very apartment. "It wasn't about the money, Dad," he'd said, his voice dangerously quiet. "It was that you didn't even ask. You gambled my mother's legacy. You gambled me. You lost. There's nothing left to say." He hadn't called since, so Arthur drifted. He was 65, with a bad knee and a portfolio of regrets. His legacy was a cloud of dust, a son who hated him, a dead wife he could no longer remember clearly. He was a patriarch of nothing. Some days, the weight of his failure was a physical thing, pressing down on his chest until he could barely draw breath. He would stand at the window, watching the vibrant London life bustle below, feeling utterly disconnected, as if he were watching a film in a language he didn't understand. He was waiting to die, but death was taking its sweet, humiliating time. It was during one of these gray, featureless afternoons that he found the website. He'd been tumbling down an internet rabbit hole, clicking from articles on experimental fertility treatments to expatriate forums, a morbid curiosity guiding his fingers. The site was called Eternal Bloodlines. It was discreet, professional, and deeply strange. It connected patrons of significant life experience with families in remote regions who, for cultural and spiritual reasons, sought to introduce new vitality into their lineage. It was, he slowly gathered, a high-concept surrogacy agency for the desperate and the esoteric. He almost laughed. The arrogance of it, patrons of significant life experience. It was a euphemism for old men with money and no heirs. But he didn't close the tab. He read the testimonials, translated from a dozen languages, speaking of honor, of new beginnings, of ancient traditions preserved. He saw a picture of the Mongolian steppe, a vast, achingly beautiful emptiness that seemed to mirror the landscape of his own soul on a whim. Fueled by a glass of expensive whiskey he couldn't afford and a profound, bottomless loneliness, he filled out the form. He listed his age, his clean bill of health, his tragic little story sanitized for public consumption. Widowed. Financially secure, seeking to create a lasting legacy. He felt a hot flush of shame as he clicked submit. It was the act of a pathetic, desperate old man. He forgot about it, till the email arrived a month later. Your application, the bat by our family. The message was concise. A family in the Khenti province of Mongolia, the fabled birthplace of Genghis Khan, had chosen him.
Oh.
They were of a noble, if now humble, lineage. They required a male heir to carry on their name and traditions. There was a problem with the husbands. Vitality. A delicate phrasing that Arthur understood. They were not interested in a sperm bank. They believed the character and spirit, the Kimorier or wind horse of the donor, were paramount. They wanted to meet him. They wanted him to live with them. The financial offer was paradoxically modest. It wasn't about the money for them, the email stressed. It was about the man. They had seen his photo, read his sanitized biography, and felt a connection. He should have deleted it. It was madness. A scam. A one-way ticket to being robbed and left for dead on the steppe. But then he looked at the photograph attached to the email. A family of 3 standing before a white gyre. A man, broad-shouldered and proud. A woman, her face gentle and intelligent, a hint of sadness in her eyes. And an older woman, her face a miracle of wrinkles, staring at the camera with an unnerving intensity. They looked real. They looked like they believed. And in their belief, Arthur saw a sliver of a chance. Not just for a legacy, but for an escape. An escape from the ghost of Eleanor, from the ghost of his own failure, from the suffocating silence of his life. To be chosen, to be wanted not for his money, but for his spirit. False as he knew it to be, was a balm on a wound he thought was fatal. He wired the money. He packed a bag. He told no one where he was going. Simply left, closing the door on his Kensington mausoleum, a ghost slipping out into the world in search of a new body to haunt. The transition from London to the steppe was a violent birthing. Ulaanbaatar was a shock of Soviet-era concrete and frantic capitalism, a city straining at its seams. But it was still a city. The true new world began where the asphalt ended. Ulaanbaatar met him in a battered but resolute Russian jeep. The handshake was a test of strength, his grip hard and calloused, his eyes assessing Arthur with a mixture of suspicion and hope. For 12 hours they drove, the jeep lurching over dirt tracks that were mere suggestions of a road. The landscape unspooled into an ocean of grass under a sky so vast it felt like a physical weight. There were no trees, no fences, no power lines, Just the wind, a relentless scouring force that seemed to peel away the layers of his old life. Leaving his soul raw and exposed, he felt a primal fear. The sheer emptiness was terrifying. He was a speck, utterly at the mercy of this man in this land. Yet beneath the fear was a strange exhilaration. No one knew where he was. Finch, who had failed his son, who had sat weeping in a silent apartment, had ceased to exist. It was a blank slate. The Gare camp was a small cluster of white domes in a shallow valley, huddled against the wind. Horses and sheep dotted the hillsides like scattered stones. This was the home of the Bat Bayar family. Oyan, the grandmother, greeted him not with a handshake, but by taking his face in her gnarled hands and studying him as if reading a book, her black eyes missing nothing. He felt stripped bare. Then came Alton. She emerged from the main Gare, wiping her hands on an apron. She was more beautiful than in the photograph, with high cheekbones and eyes that held the deep, melancholic wisdom of the landscape. She bowed, her head murmuring a greeting, but not before her gaze met his for a fleeting second. In that glance, he saw not just sadness, but a fierce, intelligent curiosity. She wasn't just a passive vessel. She was a woman sizing up her fate. The culture shock was a physical assault. The smell of mutton fat clung to everything. The food was hearty and monotonous: boiled meat, hard cheese, fermented mares, milk ragged that tasted of sour smoke, and made his head spin. The toilet was a hole in the ground behind a flimsy screen that offered no protection from the howling wind. There was no privacy. The family lived, ate, and slept in the single circular room of the main Gur. He lay on his cot at night, listening to their breathing, their murmurs, the intimate sounds of a family, feeling like an intruder, a cuckoo in the nest. They spoke to him through Ganbatar. His English was halting but functional. They asked him about his life, his family, his work. He gave them the same sanitized story, but it felt thin and dishonest here under the weight of their earnestness. They, in turn, told him of their history. They were descendants of a minor Khan. Their lineage, a source of immense pride, but little practical benefit. Ganbatar was a skilled herdsman, but their flock was shrinking. The winters were getting harsher, the world was changing, and their old ways felt fragile. Their only son had died as a toddler. A fever that had swept through the valley. Had been unable to conceive since. Alton is healthy, Ganbatar explained one evening, his eyes on the fire. The doctor in the city says, My seed is tired. His spirit is weak. It was then that Oyan, speaking through her grandson, laid out the true nature of the deal. Arthur listened, the salty milk tea in his hands growing cold. It wasn't about a syringe. It was about a union, a spiritual one, they insisted. For a child to inherit his kimori, his life force, his spirit had to be woven into the fabric of their family. He had to live with them, work with them, breathe their air, eat their food, and understand their connection to the land, the sky, the ancestors. He had to become one of them. Only then, when his spirit was aligned with theirs, could the transfer happen. Transfer? Arthur asked, his voice hoarse. Ganbatar stared into the flames. On a night of power, when the sky is right, you and Alton will share a bed. It is not for pleasure. It is a ceremony, a sacred duty. Uyan will guide it. I will guard it. It is the only way. The world tilted on its axis. Arthur felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't surrogacy. This was sanctioned adultery, a ritualistic cuckolding. No. He looked at Ganbatar, expecting to see shame or anger, but saw only a profound, desperate solemnity. He looked at Alton, who was mending a piece of clothing on the other side of the jar, her face impassive, as if she were listening to a weather report. Had she no say in this? Was this her duty, her sacrifice? He wanted to scream. He wanted to demand his money back, to call the agency, to get back in that jeep and flee this insane, primitive arrangement. It was morally repugnant. It was a violation of every principle he held. He was being asked to sleep with another man's wife, their husband's blessing, to fulfill some mystical nonsense about a wind horse. But as he looked around the warm, fire-lit gur at the earnest faces, the deep-seated belief another feeling crept in, insidious and powerful. He was not just an anonymous donor here, he was a figure of hope, savior. They had chosen him, his spirit. Back in London, his spirit was a shriveled, bankrupt thing. Here, it was a commodity of immense value. And then he looked at Alton again. She glanced up, and her eyes met his across the fire. There was no seduction in her look, no fear. There was only a quiet, shared understanding of the strange, impossible situation they were in. He thought of his empty apartment. The silence, the whiskey, the slow, lonely march towards death. Here, there was life. However strange and shocking, was purpose. There was a fire and food and the sound of human breathing in the dark. To leave would be to return to the void, to stay. To stay would be to step off a moral cliff into an unknown world. The choice was between his deeply ingrained ethics and the irresistible temptation of a life that had meaning. He looked at Gambatar, whose entire lineage rested on this single, bizarre hope. He looked at Alton, whose body was to be the vessel for that hope. And he thought, would I do this if I were them? He picked up his bowl of tea, his hand shaking, and took a sip. It was warm and salty and real. I will stay, he heard himself say, the words feeling like they were spoken by another man. I will do as you ask. In that moment, the line between right and wrong, between savior and sinner, didn't just blur. It vanished into the vast, indifferent Mongolian wind. The days bled into weeks, and the weeks into a month, then two. The brutal shock of the new world softened into a routine, a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the animals. Arthur, the London consultant who once commanded boardrooms, learned to herd sheep. His first attempts were a comedy of errors. The city man in hiking boots stumbling over the tussocks, shouting uselessly at the indifferent flock as Ganbatar watched with a stony, almost amused patience. But slowly he learned to read the clouds, to anticipate the turn of the wind. He learned the difference between the cry of a hawk and the bleat of a lost lamb. His body changed. The soft paunch he'd cultivated in London tightened. His skin, exposed to the relentless sun and wind, turned brown and leathery. The pain in his knee subsided, replaced by the honest ache of muscles used for their intended purpose. He worked alongside Ganbatar, mending fences, clearing stones from the pasture, and hauling water from the well. They rarely spoke, but in their shared labor, a silent understanding grew. It was a language of nods, of grunts, of passing a tool without being asked. Arthur began to see the pride in Ganbatar, not as a wall, but as a foundation. The man was bound to this land, to his history, and his desperation was not for himself, but for the continuation of something larger. Arthur's respect for him, grudging at first, deepened into a quiet admiration. His relationship with Alton was more complex, a delicate dance of proximity and distance. She was the quiet center of the family's universe. She cooked, she mended, she milked the goats, she turned the sheep's wool into felt, her hands always busy. She moved with an economy and grace that mesmerized him, found himself watching. Her, the way the light caught the curve of her neck as she stirred a pot. The faint smile that touched her lips when one of the lambs nuzzled her hand. He began to teach her English. They would sit by the fire in the evenings after Ohan had gone to her own gar, and Ganbatar was outside checking the animals. Ack! He would point to objects cup fire, spoon and. She would repeat the words, her voice soft, her brow furrowed in. Concentration. In return, she taught him the names of the constellations, stories of the spirits that lived in the mountains. The sacredness of the sky, Tengri. You have sad eyes, she said to him one evening, in surprisingly clear English. It was the first time she had offered an observation about him. Arthur was taken aback. Do I? She nodded, her gaze direct. Like the sky before a storm, she paused, then added, Ganbatar. He has angry eyes, like the storm itself. But you are the quiet before it. He didn't know how to respond. He felt seen in a way he hadn't been in years, perhaps ever. Eleanor had loved him, but she had seen the man she wanted him to be. Mark had seen the father who had failed him. Alton saw something else. She saw a sadness that was so familiar to him he had forgotten it was there. An intimacy grew between them that had nothing to do with the impending ritual. It was an intimacy of shared silence, of small gestures. When he coughed from the smoke, she would move to open the flap of the gear a little wider.
How would I be?
When she pricked her finger while sewing, he would fetch the small tin of antiseptic balm without a word. It was a fragile, dangerous connection. He felt a deep paternal affection for her, a desire to protect her from the harshness of her life and the bizarre duty that had been forced upon her. But beneath it, a different feeling stirred, something he hadn't felt since he was a young man. A longing. It was wrong. It was another man's wife. She was to be the mother of his child. She was 30 years his junior. It was a taboo thought, a spark of desire that he tried to extinguish as soon as it appeared. But it was there, a warm coal glowing in the cold emptiness of his past. He was becoming part of them. He no longer felt like an intruder. He laughed with Ganbatar. When a goat escaped its pen, he listened, rapt, as Oyan told ancient stories, her voice a hypnotic chant. He felt a fierce possessive pride in their small flock, their resilience, their unwavering dignity. The shame of his London life began to feel distant, like a story about someone else. The lines were blurring. He had come to plant a seed and leave, but roots were growing, anchoring him to this place, to these people. The looming ceremony changed in his mind. It was no longer a grotesque clinical transaction. It had taken on the weight of their belief. He started to see it through. Their eyes a sacred act of creation, a weaving together of spirits. The Western morality he had clung to felt flimsy and irrelevant here under the immense, watchful eye of the Mongolian sky. He was not betraying Ganbatar. He was helping him. He was not exploiting Alton. He was honoring her. The self-deception was seductive because it was comforting. It turned a moral transgression into a noble sacrifice. One afternoon, found Alton weeping silently by the river, her shoulders shaking. He approached cautiously. He had never seen her lose her composure. "What is it?" he asked gently. She wiped her eyes, embarrassed. "It is foolish. Tell me." She looked out at the water. "My friend, in the next valley. She has a new baby, a son." Her voice broke. "She says I am cursed, that our family will turn to dust." Anger surged in Arthur. Sat beside her on the cold stones. He wanted to tell her it was nonsense, that their plan was crazy, that there were clinics and doctors who could help. But he knew those words would be meaningless, cruel. Instead, he reached out and, after a moment's hesitation, placed his hand over hers. Her skin was cold. "You are not cursed," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that surprised him. "You are the strongest person I have ever met. You are carrying the hope of everyone. That is not a curse, that is a burden, and you are carrying it with grace." She looked at him, her dark eyes shining with unshed tears. She didn't pull her hand away. In that moment, by the rushing river, a boundary was crossed. It wasn't sexual, but it was profoundly intimate. A connection was forged, a bond that went deeper than duty or ritual. He was no longer just the donor, the outsider. He was the one who saw her strength, not just her womb. And in her eyes he saw not just gratitude, but a flicker of something else, affection. It was wrong, and it was tempting, and it felt more real than anything he had ever known. As the first snows of winter began to dust the high peaks, Oyen announced that the time was near. The winter solstice, the longest night of the year, was a night of great power. The ceremony would be then. A strange calm settled over Arthur. The moral debate within him had ceased. He had chosen his path. He had shed the skin of Arthur Finch, the failed London patriarch. He was now something else, a man defined not by his past regrets, but by a future he was helping to create in the most unconventional way imaginable. He was a part of this family, and he would see this through. The question of right and wrong had been replaced by a simpler, more powerful force: loyalty. The night of the solstice was colder than anything Arthur had ever experienced. The wind was a living creature, a wolf, howling down from Siberia, clawing at the felt walls of the ger. But inside, it was a pocket of sacred warmth. The central fire burned high, casting flickering shadows that danced like spirits. The air was thick with the scent of burning juniper, and hot metal from a brand Oyan was heating in the coals, and knelt on a new, white sheepskin rug. She had bathed and wore a simple, unadorned silk shift. Her hair was unbound. She looked like a priestess, her face pale and serene, her eyes fixed on the fire. Ganbatar stood by the door, a sentinel guarding the threshold between the mundane and the magical. He had been drinking arag, and his eyes had a feverish intensity, but he was steady. He was not a cuckold. He was a high priest, overseeing the most important ritual of his life. Oyan approached Arthur. She held a shallow bowl containing a dark, steaming liquid. "Drink," she commanded, her voice raspy. Ganbatar translated, "It is for courage. It quiets the mind." Arthur took the bowl. The liquid was bitter and herbal, with a fiery kick of homemade vodka. It spread a strange heat through his veins, dulling the sharp edges of his anxiety, leaving a core of focused calm. He felt strangely disconnected from his own body, a witness to his own actions. The ceremony began. Oyan chanted, her voice rising and falling in a hypnotic cadence. It was a story, a history of their people, a plea to the ancestors and to Tengri, the eternal sky. Ganbatar picked up a horsehead fiddle and began to play a single, droning note that vibrated in Arthur's bones. Then he began to throat sing. The sound was unearthly, a low growl and a high whistling overtone emerging from his throat at the same time. It was the sound of the wind, the earth, the very soul of this place. Arthur felt the last vestiges of his Western skepticism dissolve. He was no longer in a tent in Mongolia. He was at the center of the universe, at a nexus of time and belief where the spirits of the past and the potential of the future were being called into one room. Oyan took the hot brand from the fire. It glowed with a dull red anger. She approached. Alton, enchanting, pressed it not to her skin, but to the sheepskin rug on either side of her, searing the wool, the smell sharp and pungent, a mark of purification. Then she turned to Arthur and did the same, marking the space around him. They were now in a consecrated space. Finally, Oyan looked at him, her black eyes seeming to pierce through to his soul. "It is time," Ganbatar translated, his voice hoarse. "Do not bring shame, bring life." Oyan retreated to the shadows. Of the gur, her chanting softening to a low murmur. Ganbatar turned his back, facing the door, his fiddle silent, his shoulders rigid. He was giving them the space, a guardian holding the world at bay. This was the moment. His strange journey, the unforgivable decision. Arthur moved towards Alton. He knelt before her on the sheepskin. Firelight played on her face. Her eyes were closed. She was trembling slightly. He reached out, his hand shaking, and touched her cheek. Her skin was soft as velvet. He expected to feel a surge of lust or guilt or shame. He felt none of it. He felt only a profound, overwhelming tenderness and a sense of shared fate. This was not a betrayal. It was a consummation of a different kind of union, a sealing of the pact he had made, not just with them, but with himself. He leaned in and whispered the only Mongolian word she had taught him that seemed to fit. Tengri sky, a recognition of the sacredness of the moment. Her eyes opened. They were dark pools, reflecting the firelight. In them, he saw no fear, no resignation. He saw acceptance, and something more, trust. She trusted him to see this not as a sordid act, but as the ceremony. It was meant to be. He had to choose his truth. The truth of the shamed Londoner committing a mortal sin, or the truth of the man reborn on the steppe, fulfilling a sacred duty. He looked at Ganbatar's unmoving back, a pillar of trust. He heard Oyan's ancient prayer. He felt the warmth. Of Alton's skin, he made his choice. He embraced their truth, shed the last ragged pieces of his old self, and committed to the act, not with passion, but with a reverence that felt more profound than any passion he had ever known. In the heart of the Mongolian winter, under the watchful eyes of another man's gods? Arthur Finch, the ghost of Kensington, made a decision from which there could be no return. He chose not redemption or ruin, but a strange, unsettling fusion of both. He closed his eyes and gave himself over to the fire, the chant, and the unforgivable, life-affirming act of creation. A year passed. The earth completed its long, slow circle around the sun. The brutal winter gave way to a brief, riotous spring, then a summer of green abundance. And now the first chill of autumn was once again biting at the air. The child was born in late summer, during a thunderstorm that shook the very foundations of the hills. It was a boy. He was healthy, strong, with a shock of black hair and eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of the steppes from the moment they opened. They named him Dorge, but to Arthur, he was simply the boy. Alton's pregnancy had been confirmed a month after the solstice. The family's joy was a quiet, profound thing. Ganbatar's angry eyes had softened. He walked with a new lightness, a man whose future had been restored. The way he looked at Alton was filled with a renewed tenderness and awe. He treated Arthur with a deep, almost formal respect, as one would a revered elder or a holy man. The dynamic had shifted. Arthur was no longer the guest, the donor. He was the source. He had never felt such a sense of belonging. His life in London was a dream, a half-forgotten film. This was reality, teaching the boy his first word, boater, hero, watching him take his first wobbly steps on the hard-packed earth floor of the Gur, feeling the boy's small hand wrap around his finger. He was a father again, but this time it was different. There was no ambition, no expectation, just the pure, elemental fact of the child's existence. He had not just given a seed. He had transplanted his own withered roots into this rich, foreign soil, and they had taken hold. He was the patriarch, the quiet, gray-haired king of this tiny, isolated kingdom. One afternoon, as he sat outside, the Gur, rocking the boy in a makeshift sling against his chest, Ganbatar approached him with a rare and precious object, a satellite phone. "For you," he said. "A call. From your world." Arthur's heart seized. His world? He had no world but this. He took the phone, his hand trembling. The voice on the other end was distorted by static. A ghost from another life. "Dad? Dad? Can you hear me?" It was Mark. A torrent of conflicting emotions washed over Arthur. Anger, guilt, love, confusion. He wanted to tell his son everything. He wanted to scream at him for the silence, for the abandonment. He wanted to describe the vastness of the sky, the birth of the boy, the impossible, beautiful, terrifying life he now led. "Mark," he managed, his voice a dry rasp. "Dad, listen." Mark's voice crackled, urgent. "I don't have much time. I have to tell you something. That agency, eternal bloodlines, it wasn't real." Arthur froze, the baby shifting against his chest. "What are you talking about?" "There's no agency, Dad. I made it. The website, the emails, it was all me." The world, which had felt so solid, so real, suddenly seemed to dissolve into shimmering heat haze. The wind, the sky, the child in his arms. What was real? Why? Arthur whispered. The word was swallowed by the wind. Mark's voice cracked. "With static and emotion? Because you were dying? I saw you in that apartment. You were a ghost. You were just waiting to die, and I couldn't. I couldn't watch it. After Mom died, you just disappeared. The money, I never cared about the money, you idiot. I cared that I'd lost you." Arthur sank down onto a stool, his legs giving way. He looked at his hands, the gnarled, sun-beaten hands of a shepherd. They didn't feel like his own. "I started searching," Mark continued, his voice rushing. "Just crazy stuff online. People looking for different ways to live, and I found them. A post on some obscure forum, his family. Their story was real. The dead son, the sterile husband. They were desperate. They were willing to do anything. So I built the whole thing around them. I built it for you. I thought, I thought, if I could just get you out of there, give you something to do, a purpose, even a crazy one. It was a terrible idea. It was insane. I was going to lose you. For good. I'm so sorry, Dad. I just wanted you to live again. The line went dead. Arthur sat there, the heavy satellite phone in his lap, the silence of the step rushing back in. He looked up. Ganbatar was watching him from a distance, his expression unreadable. Alton was coming out of the Gura bowl. In her hands, her face breaking into a soft smile when she saw him with the boy. The boy, his boy, gurgled in his sleep, his small face peaceful. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. His exile was not an escape. It was a rescue mission. A desperate, misguided, beautiful act of love from the son he thought he had. Lost forever. The entire journey, every painful step, every moral compromise, had been orchestrated. He had been a puppet in a play written by his own child, a play designed to save his life. He looked at the boy in his arms, the product of a grand, loving deception. Was he a lie? Was this whole life a lie? Or was it the only truth that mattered? He had been sent here to become a father, to find a legacy, and he had. But the path to it was a tangled web of deceit and love, spun from thousands of miles away. He had been given a new family by the son he had driven away. The irony was a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. He didn't know whether to laugh or to weep. He never called back. He let the battery on the satellite phone die. The truth Mark had given him was a stone thrown into the deep pool of his new life. And Arthur chose to let the ripples fade, to let the stones sink to the bottom and be forgotten. To acknowledge it would be to unravel the fragile tapestry he now called home. He stayed. It was no longer Arthur Finch of Kensington. It was Artur, the old man, the elder of the Bat Bayar clan. His English grew rusty, his Mongolian fluid. Da-da-da-da-da. Years fell away, marked not by calendars but by the turning of the seasons, the birth of lambs, the growth of the boy. Biambadorj grew tall and strong, with Ganbatar's pride and Alton's quiet intelligence. And in the boy's eyes, sometimes Arthur saw a flicker of his own restless curiosity. A ghost of a world the boy would never know. He never knew if the family knew the truth about the agency. He suspected Oyan, with her ancient, all-seeing eyes, knew everything from the very beginning. Sometimes she would watch him, a small, knowing smile on her lips, silent conspirator in the grand deception that had saved them all. The relationship between the three adults settled into a strange and stable harmony. He was the grandfather, Ganbatar, the father, Alton the mother. They were a complete, unconventional unit, bound by a shared secret and a shared love for the child who was the center of their world. The taboo of the boy's conception was never spoken of again. It was a founding myth, sacred and untouchable. His life in London, his son Mark. They became memories distant and poignant, like a beautiful, sad song heard long ago. It felt a deep, abiding love for the son who had sent him away, a love that transcended distance and silence. Mark had not abandoned him. He had set him free. Was it selfish? Was it loving? Arthur no longer cared for the distinction. One evening, years later, he sat on a low hill overlooking the camp. He was an old man now, truly old, his body stooped, but his spirit calm. The boy, now a young man, was sparring with Ganbatar there, laughter echoing in the clear, cold air. Alton was inside the jair, the warm light spilling from the doorway, the smell of supper on the wind. Oyan was gone, buried on a sacred mountain facing the rising sun. He looked at his hands, the road map of his life etched into the skin. He had come here seeking a legacy, a single branch on a family tree. Instead, he had become the root of a new one. He had been sent to a remote land by a son he thought he'd lost, to impregnate the wife of a stranger, and in that deeply transgressive act, he had found not sin, but a strange and profound grace. He had saved them, and they had saved him and his son from half a world away. Had saved them all. He was a father twice over, and a son to none. He was a ghost and a king, a secret and a truth, sitting under the endless, silent, watching eye of the Mongolian sky. and for the first time in his long and fractured life, he felt completely, irrevocably whole.